organizer here at the Mississippi NAACP. But I just want to thank y'all for joining us for this very critical conversation about fiscal policy in Mississippi and how fiscal policy impacts our communities. The State House of Representatives recently passed the bill, House Bill 1439, which would eliminate the state's income tax and increase the sales tax. So with us today to talk about fiscal policy is Ms. Kyra Roby. Kyra is a native of Madison, Mississippi. She received her high school diploma from Madison Central High School. She received her Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Mississippi Croft Institute for International Studies in 2010, and she holds a 2014 law degree from the University of Mississippi School of Law. As a law student, she worked for the American Civil Liberties Union in Jackson and the Southern Poverty Law Center in New Orleans, performing work concerning constitutional law, poverty, immigration, education, and prison reform. She also worked as a student attorney in the university's Child Advocacy and Innocence Project clinics. After graduating from law school, Kyra served 2 years as an Equal Justice Works AmeriCorps legal fellow, working to remove barriers to employment for people with arrest and conviction histories through expungement and other means. She later worked as a staff attorney at the MacArthur Justice Center in New Orleans, where her work focused on criminal justice reform and various other civil and human rights cases. And she previously worked as a partnership specialist with the United States Census Bureau. Kyra is currently a policy analyst at One Voice. She is a member of Word of Life Church in Flowood, Mississippi, and she is the devoted mother to her son, Jackson Roby. So without further ado, Ms. Kyra Roby.
Thank you, Matthew, and thank you to the Mississippi State Conference NAACP for having me here today on this beautiful Saturday. We have a lot to discuss, and so I'm really excited to share some information with you all around One Voice's fiscal policy campaign and show you ways that fiscal policy affects our communities. So what I'll first do is start with basically the basics of fiscal policy, of our fiscal policy work, just so that you have some basic information about what we're talking about. And then we'll dive into a deep overview of House Bill 1439. I'm sure you guys are excited to hear about that. And we'll probably share more than you even want to know, but we want to make sure that you're well informed about that particular bill. And then I'll close by sharing this information about what good tax and budget policy would look like in Mississippi and what an equitable tax system might look like here in the state, or what we're working to try to achieve. I don't want to talk all morning, but it is a lot of information. So what I'll do is in between the topics, we'll take a break and allow you all to ask questions. And I think you can put your questions in the chat, and I'll do my best to follow with them. And we'll just, have many discussions during the topic breaks. So if that's all okay, we'll start with just a brief definition of what fiscal policy is. Okay, there we go. So fiscal policy, this is a definition that I kind of like the best. It is basically a government's plan for deciding how much money to borrow and to collecting taxes and how best to spend it in order to influence the level of economic activity. So I think sometimes when we begin talking about fiscal policy, it scares some people. When we're talking about numbers and data and all these kind of things and taxes, it's a little off-putting at sometimes. And it always isn't kind of the sexiest topic to talk about in terms of this work. But we want to make sure that our community kind of gets a better idea about what it is and what it looks like and its overall impact in communities across the state. At One Voice, we support policies that help increase revenue, that help fund the services and programs that the states provide, such as education, healthcare, criminal justice, infrastructure, those types of things, and policies that help reduce poverty and promote equity. And so you'll see these three things in a lot of the work that we do, and you'll see it actually play out when we talk about House Bill 1439 and some of the other policy issues or matters that we're looking at. And so when you think about increasing revenue or supporting policies that increase revenue, what we're basically trying to do is help promote economic growth. So just making sure that the state has enough money to spend on the things that we want it to spend money on. And so if you see tax policies, for instance, that support or that promote tax cuts, then that question of revenue becomes really important to us, because we want to see if you're cutting taxes on particular groups of people. We want to study or analyze the impact of those tax cuts on that income group and all income groups in general, but also what is the impact of that on state revenue? And if taxes are cut, then how can the state help pay or raise additional revenue to pay for the services that it provides? And how does it pay, or how can it invest in the things that we want it to pay for? And so those are examples of tax policies that might come into question when we look at revenue increases and economic growth. When we're talking about funding services and programs, so basically the money that comes in, especially from state taxes and sometimes from federal taxes and other money that the state, or other revenue that the state collects. The state pays for its education systems, healthcare systems, all these types of things with that money. And so we want to make sure that the tax policies that are introduced or that we currently have actually help fund those services and programs. And maybe we should say adequately fund those services and programs. So for instance, we know that the state's budget is spent on schools, but we also know that the school system or the education system hasn't been adequately funded. So, again, when we're talking about revenue and how much money the state brings in, we want to make sure that these services and programs that impact our communities and that help strengthen our communities are cared for. Similarly with Medicaid expansion, that's something that we're currently working on, another matter that we're currently working on. And so, if you're talking about the cost of Medicaid expansion, we want to make sure, again, that the state has enough revenue in order to fund these services, or we want them to invest in these services and programs, then we want to, look at the state's budget and look at revenue to see how that might happen. Criminal justice funding has been a big topic, especially over, last year and things like that. So that's something else, another example of supporting policies that help fund the services and programs that we want to see, or that we don't want to see as well. And then reducing poverty and promoting equity. And so we know that there are inequities that exist, because of historic reasons and things like that. And so we want to see how state tax and budget policies actually impact working families. How does it help, all Mississippians? And so some examples of those are proposals that might create a state earned income tax, that might increase minimum wage, or that might create an equal pay law in Mississippi. So these are just examples of these three themes that we look at, and you'll see more of this woven throughout the presentation. Before we go further, I want to talk about just some of the basics of the state's tax and budget system, so that you guys have some kind of knowledge or basic understanding of kind of the groundwork of where we are. And so these next few slides will do that. So this slide answers the question of where does the state get its money? 45% state revenue comes from federal government, 44% from state taxes, and 11% from other sources such as licenses, fees, permits, and those types of things. I know I talked to a lot of you about the census and making sure Mississippi received a complete and accurate count of the census numbers, because that data was used to determine how much money came into the state for like the federal government, for instance. And so that's an example of money that comes in to the federal government to fund our services and programs. We're going to talk a lot about state taxes today, and that's what a lot of our work focuses on, because they do make up a large percentage of the state's general fund budget. And the general fund is basically the main operating fund in the state. So if we look at state tax revenue in fiscal year 2019, so that's the most recent data that we have from the Mississippi Department of Revenue, we see that sales taxes or revenue from sales taxes actually make up the largest percent of tax revenue that comes into the state. Sales taxes make up 37%, to be specific, of state tax revenue. The second largest source of tax revenue in the state comes from revenue from the individual income tax, which comprises of 32% of the state's tax budget. Then you see we also have corporate taxes, tobacco tax, insurance premium tax, use tax, and those types of things. And so this just kind of gives you an idea about how much revenue is coming into the state to spend on these programs and services that we're talking about, specifically related to state tax revenue. This next slide talks about how does the state spend its money. And again, we're talking about the general fund, which is the main operating fund in the state. As you can see, the state spends the majority of its money on educational activities. So this includes public education and higher ed. The second largest chunk of what the state spends its money on is social welfare. So this includes the Governor's Office Division of Medicaid, Child Protection Services, some parts of the Department of Human Services, and the Department of Rehabilitation Services. The third, another source of, or another way that the state spends its money through the Department of Corrections. So it's the corrections budget is like 5% in the state's budget. And so these are some of the things that we highlight because these are where a lot of the programs and services that we care about lie. And so I want you guys just to have a basic or general idea of where the state spends its money and how it's divided. I would say too, with this slide in total, this general fund, the operating fund of the state, comprises about $5.6 billion. Now let's talk about equity and inequality, because again, when I mentioned we were looking at revenue, we're looking at the funding of different services and programs in the state, and then we're looking at poverty reduction and equity. And so you'll see kind of these themes between equity and equality mentioned throughout the presentation and through our fiscal policy work. When we're talking about equity, we're basically talking about how an individual or a group can be given the same resources and opportunities. When we're talking about equity, on the other hand, we're talking about recognizing that each person has different circumstances. And, we're questioning how do we allocate the exact resources and opportunities needed to reach a more equal outcome. And so you'll see these interchanges between inequality and inequities woven throughout some of the tax policy work, fiscal policy work that we do. And so I know I'm preaching to the choir about this particular topic, but I just wanted to bring it up and highlight some of the main kind of themes, again, that you'll see throughout our work. The information provided is from a report by the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities titled Advancing Racial Equity with State Tax Policy. And what's basically showing right now is income inequality across America. And so basically what the report shows is that the wealthiest 1% hold about 40% of wealth. White households, which comprises of 65% of total households across the nation, own 80% of the nation's wealth. Households headed by persons of color, on the other hand, which comprises of 35% of all households in America, own just 13% of the nation's wealth. And again, you know that in terms of income inequality, there are racial components to that as well. And so the median net worth of white households in America is $171,000. Black households is $17,600. And Latinx households is $20,700. In Mississippi, we're still combing through a lot of the race data that's coming in through some of our national partners, particularly the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy. But in Mississippi, Black families earn an average of 43.1% less than other households. And this is before state and local taxes are taken. Hispanic households earn just 25.9% less than other Mississippi households before state and local taxes are taken. So that gives you a picture of what income inequality looks like across the nation and in Mississippi. Again, when we're talking about inequality, when we're talking about race, matters of race, there are matters of gender as well. And so in terms of the gender pay gap, women in the US are paid only 82 cents for every dollar paid to their male counterparts. Black women in particular across America are paid just 63% of every dollar when compared to their white non-Hispanic male counterparts. Latinas are paid just 55 cents for every dollar paid to their white non-Hispanic male counterparts, and Native Americans are paid 60% every dollar compared to their white male Hispanic counterparts. So again, when we're talking about income inequities or inequality, we have to look at the racial components and the gender components as well, because of these historic inequities within the system and of how it plays out in particular in tax policy. I mentioned gender, the gender pay gap. I also found that according to the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, this is based on 2018 data in Mississippi, women are paid just 76.7% of the median usual weekly earnings of male counterparts. So that's the information for Mississippi in terms of kind of where that gender pay gap states. So I know that all of these are just different comparisons, but the main takeaway is to help give you a better picture of, one, what the current income inequality looks like across America and in Mississippi, other than what we already know, and two, just seeing the interconnectedness between income inequality and race inequality and race equity. And so you'll see this through the presentation. Is when we talk about income, I just always want people to keep in mind is that when we're talking about maybe differences between the top income earners in the state and the bottom income earners in the state, that there is this race and gender component to it too, just because traditionally the bottom income earners are traditionally people of color and women. This is a little bit more on advancing racial equity with state tax policy that I want you guys to be aware of, so that Mississippi does have a history in terms of its tax system in this area. One of which is that in 1830, the Mississippi legislature approved a law that required 3/5 vote in both houses of the legislature for all state tax increases. And so this is one of the oldest supermajority requirements in the nation. And so this is something that you all know about. The second of which is that in 1932, Mississippi actually enacted the first modern sales tax. And the purpose of that tax was to shift the state's tax base away from property owners, who at that time were majority white men, again, to consumers, who again at that time were majority Blacks. I think that's just important to note, just kind of again, as we talk about fiscal policy and as we talk about deepening inequities because of the state's tax system. And so again, I think those are just important things to note. So let's see kind of how all of this plays out today. What you see right now is a graph depicting the total amount of state and local taxes in Mississippi as a share of family income. And what this graph basically shows is that when we talk about an equitable tax system and what that might look like, we first have to realize that Mississippi's current tax system isn't equitable. We're talking about equity within the tax system. We're talking about making sure that everyone pays their fair share of taxes. And what you see is that the lowest income groups in Mississippi actually pay a higher percentage of their income in taxes than do the state's top income earners. And so when we say that Mississippi's tax system is currently inequitable, this is what we're talking about. Again, that income inequity, and then when you bring in the race and gender components, the race equity and gender equity issues that we want to help fix. This is another example of income inequality that is done by the tax system. And so, you know, again, when we're talking about disparities within the tax system, it's not to say that the tax system causes it, but the data shows that the state's tax system plays an active role in worsening disparities. And so you see this when we're looking at the differences in taxes paid by income groups based on the state's 3 major taxes. And so what you see right now is the first graph is a graph of this sales and excise taxes paid as a percentage of income groups, as a percentage of income by income groups in Mississippi. And what you see again is that the state's lower income groups pay a larger percentage of their income in the sales tax than do the state's higher income groups. And so again, I want you to kind of keep all of this in mind as we talk about House Bill 1439 and some of the other tax proposals or tax matters that we'll talk about later on this morning. Property taxes are a little bit more evenly split, but still you see that the tax burden kind of falls again on lower and middle income families. Income taxes, on the other hand, are different. So income taxes are actually, or is the only major tax out of these three taxes in which the higher income groups pay a larger percentage of their income on this particular tax than do the other taxes. And so what we say is that individual income tax is a progressive tax, whereas the sales tax is a regressive tax. So I just want you guys to see that comparison between the sales tax and the income tax. And again, in thinking about equity and inequality, again, just getting the picture about what a fair tax system means in terms of making sure that everyone pays their fair share. So before we see how this plays out in terms of tax policy, and before we dive deep into House Bill 1439, I was going to take a break just to see if anybody had any questions about any of the information I just shared, any comments. Not, we'll keep going. So House Bill 1439. So Matthew mentioned this particular bill, and so we're gonna take a deep dive into this. What I want you to know about House Bill 1439 is that it was introduced on Monday, February 22nd. It was titled the Mississippi Taxpayer Freedom Act of 2021. It passed the House Ways and it passed out of the House Ways and Means Committee on Tuesday, February 23rd, so just 24 hours after it was introduced. It was a massive tax bill that was approximately 300 pages long. The bill contained no fiscal note, so no note on what the particular policies or proposals in the plan would cost. The bill was deemed to be revenue neutral by the state lawmakers that introduced it, and that it will create a fair tax structure for the state of Mississippi. We think, if you haven't been able to tell by now, that both of these claims are false, and I'll explain that through data produced by the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy upon request of One Voice. And so let's take a look at the key proposals in House Bill 1439. The key tax proposals in the bill, again, I said it was 300 pages, so it contained a lot of stuff. But what we've been looking at are these things, one of which is a phased approach to the elimination of Mississippi's individual income tax. The second of which is that it contained an increase in the state's general sales tax rate from 9.5%, to 9.5% from 7%. It contained a reduction in the sales tax paid on groceries to 3.5% from 7%. It included a sales tax base broadening, and it included an increase in the tax paid on cigarettes by 50 cents per pack. So these are the main tax proposals included in the bill. There was also some teacher pay raise stuff in there. It was a lot, but these are the main things that we're going to talk about. And what I'm going to do actually is just break down each of these proposals one by one to show you why we don't think that it will be a revenue neutral bill, and that it won't create a fair tax structure in the state. So what you see is, I'm going to start with talking about the individual income tax elimination proposal. And this is really big, so we're actually going to spend a little bit of time on this. And again, this is one of those places where I'll stop and ask, we can open it up for questions and discussions afterward because it's a lot. But we want you guys to be really familiar about what income tax elimination is and what it isn't. So the first thing that I want you to take away from the state's proposal to eliminate the individual income tax is that individual income taxes make up a significant portion of the state's tax revenue. And we saw that at the beginning of the presentation. Individual income taxes bring in nearly $1.9 billion in revenue to the state each year. Well, not each year, but the latest data we have was in 2019, and it comprised 32% of the state's tax revenue. And so these charts just show that individual income taxes and the money from it has been a steady, significant portion of the state's revenue overall over the years. And this is a chart or a graph that you guys already saw. So again, when we're talking about revenue, we want to keep in mind that any proposal to eliminate revenue jeopardizes the funding for all these services and programs. You know, it's just like our regular budget at home. If we lose nearly $2 billion of money, and we have all these bills and things that we have to pay for, and we have all of these wants and investments that we want to see in the future, and how do we do that from the elimination of that amount of money? And so that's the same with the state. That's why this particular proposal kind of concerns us. The other thing that I want you to know about the individual income tax is, again, I mentioned in the previous slides that it is the only progressive element to the state's tax systems, tax structure. It's the only tax out of the three major taxes in which the state's highest income earners pay a larger percentage of their income in this tax than do the other taxes. And so when we see proposals to eliminate the individual income tax, then as you can imagine, the state's highest income earners stand the most to gain from this tax. So what you're looking at right now is, again, data produced by the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy. I know it's a lot of numbers, so just bear with me. We're going to explain the impact of what a full tax elimination would look like in the state. I want to note that in House Bill 1439, the proposal is actually to eliminate the income tax based on different triggers. So by levels of income, the thing about triggers is that it's almost like you're planning to fail in a way. It provides a way for state lawmakers to say, hey, we're caring about, you know, this revenue when we have something in place if it doesn't work. But you really won't understand what the impact of eliminating that much revenue comes into state until after it happens. And so that's one of the things about these triggers. And we want communities to understand that the whole idea is to eliminate the individual income tax. That's the whole purpose of it. This isn't the first time that this proposal has happened or has been brought up in the state. And if this doesn't get out of the Senate, then it probably won't be the last. And we're seeing this in other states across the country as well. So we just want you guys to have, again, an understanding of what the impact of the full income tax elimination is. What you see, and the graphs will kind of look similar after this. The first line showed the average incomes per income group. So we'll talk a lot about the lowest 20%. I think the median household income of a Mississippian lies in the middle 20%. It's actually $45,000, but the average income for that particular income group is $39,000. And then the top 1%, which is the state's wealthiest. What we see is that the impact of a full tax elimination will actually decrease the amount of taxes paid as a percentage of income on the state's wealthiest individuals the most. And so if you remember that graph that we just saw in which the state's highest income earners paid the most in this particular tax, as a result of eliminating the tax, again, they would receive the greatest benefit in terms of the amount of taxes they pay. So the amount of taxes as a percentage of their income would drop by 3.4%, whereas the lowest 20% will drop less than 1%. And again, those particular numbers don't matter as much. It's just seeing the fact that there's disparities in how much more benefit that the state's top 1% receives as opposed to the state's lowest income earners. On the next line, you'll see the average tax change. So this is actually the savings that everyone talks about. So as a result of eliminating the state income tax, the state's lowest 20% of income earners will only save about $20. So that's not very much money. And the state's top 1%, on the other hand, would save approximately $31,420. Again, the state's middle income earners, which is where the median household income of Mississippians fall, would save approximately $610. And again, the numbers matters, of course, but again, we just want you to see the disparity in how much savings actually result from eliminating the individual income tax. On the next line, you see data showing the share of tax cut, and this is really important too. When I mentioned that highest income earners in the state pay the most in this particular tax, and that they stand to gain the most as well, you'll see that actually 72% of the state's top 20% of income earners, that's that green box at the very bottom, will actually benefit from the tax cut. On the other hand, only 29% of the state's bottom 80% of income earners will actually benefit from the individual income tax. So again, when we're talking about eliminating $1.9 billion in revenue from the state, as well as basically providing a tax cut for the state's wealthy, those who would stand to benefit the most from this particular tax because they pay the most in this tax, then you see where those intersections between revenue, concerns about the funding for services and programs in the state, and concerns about income inequality and racial gender equity kind of come into play. And so that's what we're trying to show with this particular proposal within the bill alone and combined in the bill. And again, just because individual income taxes have been kind of a major topic and there's a lot of information out there about it, I want to stay on it for just a little bit. What I'm showing you right now is just a graph of the states, or a chart of the states without individual income taxes. So there are only 7 states in the country that do not have individual income taxes, and they are Alaska, Florida, Nevada, South Dakota, Texas, Washington, and Wyoming. What we see is that states without individual income taxes, again, when we're talking about revenue, their largest source of tax revenue ends up becoming property taxes and sales taxes. And some of these states within this chart have some of the highest sales tax and property tax rates in the nation. And so that kind of shows you that tax cuts don't pay them for themselves, and that in order to make up for that lost revenue so that the state can fund its services and programs, that the state usually raises other taxes in order to do so. The other important point to make, or that I would like to make through this chart, is to show you that these states that have eliminated the individual income tax, they also have significant other revenue sources that Mississippi just doesn't have. So for instance, Alaska receives billions of dollars in revenue from its oil productions. Florida, of course, has a large tourism industry, the same with Nevada. South Dakota is pretty interesting because it receives a lot, I think the most federal aid in the nation. So it doesn't necessarily have some of these other revenue sources, but it does rely very heavily on federal aid. And that's in part to make up for that lost revenue as a result of the income tax elimination. Texas, of course, has oil and natural resources. Washington is the same, and Wyoming is the same as well. And so again, when we're trying to compare Mississippi to states that do not have individual income taxes, you can kind of see where the difference lies in terms of the revenue sources that the state brings in. The Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy also did a study where it compared those states without individual income taxes, the states with the highest tax rates. And what it basically shows is that states without individual income taxes experience slower economic growth, slower growing average income for residents, little to no improvement on the economic outcomes of residents despite population growth, and they experience higher tax burdens on the poor than states with the highest tax rates. The report also found that without exception, the lowest state and local tax rates in the nation for high income taxpayers are combined to the 9 states that do not levy personal income taxes. So again, what all of this is saying is that sometimes you'll hear lawmakers say that, states experiences big economic boom as a result of eliminating individual income taxes, and that just isn't true. Or you'll hear claims that eliminating the individual income tax will bring more people to the state. There are studies that show that people don't move to states because of the state's tax system. You know, we're looking at some of the states again that have eliminated the individual income tax, like Florida, for instance. You know, if people are moving there, if they are experiencing population growth, you know, it might be due to other factors and not necessarily taxes. And so that's another big myth that we want to kind of combat. The other is that the elimination of individual income taxes will bring businesses and help promote businesses. Again, that's not necessarily true. We see in studies that kind of businesses are attracted to places where you have strong communities, and strong communities are usually built from, you know, good school systems, good infrastructure, a strong kind of criminal justice system and public safety, all those types of things, and not necessarily tax rates. And so we want to make sure that you guys are aware of that. And so when you see people talking about the benefits of eliminating individual income tax, you have a better idea of what the actual real harms are to the state. And we can compare Mississippi to some of the other states that have experienced or that have eliminated individual income taxes, and we can kind of see where we fall in that category. So again, I know that was kind of, you know, a good bit of information about the individual income tax elimination. So before we move on and talk about other components of the bill of House Bill 1439, I'll again just stop to let people ask any questions or make any comments that they would have about income tax elimination, or basically what you've heard about it. No questions? No comments about it? As I know what we hear, what I've heard as I've been out kind of talking to people a little bit more about it, is that they hear that, you know, the state wants to eliminate individual income taxes, so they see it as a good thing. And then they realize who actually benefits from this particular tax cut and what the actual impact that it will have on them and their families, and they see that it is not such a great idea. And so I don't know if you guys have heard more of the same, or if this data aligns with what you've already experienced or what you already know about this particular proposal.
I have a question now. What do this bill stands right now?
The bill stands right now, it's in the Senate. The Senate will vote on it on March 16th. So it passed the House, and so it's waiting in the Senate, waiting on a vote.
And so at this particular point, the only thing that we can do is make calls to try to get our senator to vote against this bill, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I have another question.
Yes, sir.
With this, okay, just like say with the ones of us that's 65 and over that have property, you know, you got that tax exempt that way. Would that be eliminated, or where would you stand now? You know, if you got a home that's what, 75,000, you wouldn't have to pay any tax on it, property tax, homestead exemption.
So I don't think property taxes were included in this particular bill. What we were showing with the chart previously is just that states that have eliminated the income tax tend to raise their sales and property taxes. So that the property tax wasn't outlined in the bill. We've been focusing more on the sales tax increase.
Okay. I guess it's I mean, this is great information, you know, since the virus have hit us, you know, at least I had gotten to a point that I would be at the Capitol every year. Now I'm so far removed from that, and this is great. And still it's kind of like that, you know, that how we going to really get it in the community like we really need to, because just with you, what I've heard thus far, I know up in my community, in my county, our preachers need to know this so they can kind of tell the folks where we are. Because right now, If I don't know anything about it, I know that don't too many people in our community know anything about it here in Winston County.
Yes, sir. So hopefully it's something that we can fix fairly quickly. We've been trying to do outreach to you all, the One Voice Network, just to make sure that we get the information out in the community. We're trying to get, we're working to continuously get this information in the hands of lawmakers, and we can kind of talk about that as well. We do have a fact sheet that we can share. We'll have another document coming out fairly soon that kind of explains all of this in greater detail. And so we can make sure that you have a copy of that. And we would depend on you all to share this information as well as we continue to try to push it out into the community.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and Kyra, this is Matthew too. Mr. Hampton's point about, making sure we get this stuff out to communities. One of the things that I've been concerned about with this bill, when folks hear, we're trying to eliminate the state income tax, and then also the bill reduces the groceries tax. So when people hear that, their mind might automatically go, oh, this is a good thing. This is a good proposal, right? We're eliminating the state's income tax. We're reducing the grocery tax. So that means I'm going to have more money in my pocket without realizing that, we're eliminating the state income tax. And then to offset that sum, you increase the sales tax. And then to try to offset that, you then reduce the grocery tax. Mm-hmm. And so you essentially have transferred the tax burden. But when people hear that, they don't realize that the tax burden has now been shifted. It's been transferred to low-income families, which are disproportionately African-American in this state. They hear, oh, I'm saving money. So I think on our end, we had to make sure that we get that information out to people, and communicate it in a fashion where people understand that this is not a good proposal, regardless of how it might initially sound. That you might save some money individually, but it's going to impact critical services and programs down the road that we use income tax to fund. So that's my 2 cents about it.
That's exactly right, Matthew. And so let's go ahead and talk about those things that Matthew just mentioned. Let's go ahead and talk about some of those other proposals in the bill, just to kind of make sure that we have a more comprehensive idea of what this bill actually means and the impact of it. So let's talk about the sales tax increase, because that's really important. Thank you, Matthew, for lifting that up and explaining that. It makes my job easier. So sales taxes, again, this is a chart that you already saw. Sales taxes are what we call a regressive tax. It's a tax in which the state's lowest income earners actually share the greatest tax burden in this. So the state's lowest 20 and second 20% of income earners actually pay a larger percentage of their income in sales taxes than the other taxes. A couple of things to note about Mississippi's sales tax as well is that Mississippi actually has the second highest sales tax rate in the nation already. So we're tied with Indiana, Rhode Island, and Tennessee for that second highest sales tax rate. And so when we're talking about increasing the sales tax, again, so you can kind of see who that burden will fall on. If you're increasing the sales tax, you're increasing further the amount of money that lower income groups would pay in terms of a percentage of their actual income. And so this chart showed you the impact of that particular proposal in House Bill 1439. Again, we're taking this piece by piece just to kind of break it down, and then we'll talk about the combined impact at the end. So you'll see this is that same chart where you see the average income in these lowest 20% of income groups all the way to the state's top 1% of income groups. And what it basically shows you right now is the tax change as a percentage of income. And so again, the numbers don't matter as much as just seeing that the state's bottom 80% of income earners, the amount of money that they would pay to increase the sales tax in terms of the percentage of their income would increase the greatest. Whereas the state's top 20%, the amount of taxes that they would pay as percentage of their income, it would still increase, but it wouldn't increase nearly as much as the state's bottom 80%. And so the impact on the general sales tax rate increase in Mississippi will actually increase the amount of taxes paid for everybody, for all Mississippians. But again, the lower income earners will actually see a greater change in the percentage of the income that they pay in this particular tax, as opposed to some of the other taxes. Again, we're seeing that harm benefit analysis kind of come in. This is also what Matthew mentioned, the combined impact of increasing the general sales tax rate and cutting the grocery tax. So while the grocery tax cut is, what we would think of as a good tax policy, Mississippi actually has the highest grocery tax rate in the nation. Of the 45 states that have a sales tax, 13 states tax groceries. And because we tax our groceries at our full 7% rate, we passed Alabama and South Dakota in terms of the highest sales tax rate on groceries in the nation. So that is something that we would like to see reduced, and that is an equitable tax policy. But again, when you couple that with this bill, or even with just the increase in the sales tax, you'll see that still lower income families, the amount of taxes that they would pay would increase in terms of the percentage of their income that they would pay. Whereas the state's top 20%, again, their taxes will still increase, but the percentage of income that they would pay would not increase as much as it would on the lower and middle income families. And again, the other important thing to note about the sales tax is, we're talking about necessities here. We're talking about, food and things like that. And so when we see a policy that will, again, shift that tax burden to lower and middle income families, it not only shifts their tax burden in terms of the burden or the impact of funding the government, but it actually impacts them in terms of like how much money, what percentage of their income they're paying on necessities, and how much money they would have to pay for other things. And so that's again why you see this top 20% wouldn't be affected as much, because they pay less of their income on necessities because they still have a lot more money for other things. And so even when you increase that, you see that even that increase still wouldn't impact them as much. And so that's the combined impact of the general sales tax rate increase proposal and the food tax reduction proposal that's included in House Bill 1439. And now we see kind of the combined impacts of that full income tax elimination, the general sales tax increase to 9.5%, the food tax cut to 3.5%, and the cigarette tax increase by 50%. What you see again is that the state's bottom 60% of income earners will actually pay more in taxes overall, whereas the state's top 40% of income earners will actually receive a tax cut. It's important to note again that the modeling just shows us the modeling that we have shows us the impact of these particular proposals. Again, there was a teacher pay raise proposal in this bill. There were proposals to increase the sales tax rate on various items such as farm equipment and vehicles and things like that. So we don't have modeling that shows what all of that would look like. And there was no fiscal note attached to the bill for us to compare. But again, we see that the combined impact of these key tax proposals will actually make lower and middle income families pay more in taxes. And so you see again that tax change as a percentage of income, where you see it increases the most on the state's lowest 20%, whereas the state's top 1%, the percentage of money that they would spend on income the percentage of money that they would pay in taxes compared to their income actually decreases the most. You see again the average tax change, so that's the savings. So you would see that the state's bottom or lowest 20% of income earners will actually pay a little bit over $200 more in taxes overall, and the state's top 1% will actually receive a tax cut of approximately $28,000. And again, that middle 20%, which is where the median household income of Mississippians lie, would almost be neutral, almost no impact, but they will actually receive or have to pay $30 more in taxes overall. And so this is, again, the modeling that we have. And so again, when we're talking about equity, we're talking about income inequality, we're talking about those race and general components of who fits into what categories, then we can see the overall impact of this tax bill would actually deepen or worsen the inequities that already exist in the state. The revenue, the data shows from the modeling that the revenue received as a result of this particular bill, the combined impact, will actually put the state in the hole about $678 million. But again, it's hard to tell. We haven't really been quoting those numbers just because the full impact of the bill that includes that sales tax base broadening, it's hard to kind of model all of that data together. But that's why we say that the revenue decrease or decline is actually likely with this bill, which is different or in contrast to what's being shared about this bill being tax neutral. And so overall, I want you to think about, again, those three things that we're talking about in terms of would this tax policy actually increase revenue, which we don't think that it will? How will that impact the services and programs that we all use? It would jeopardize it because we are likely decreasing the amount of revenue that comes into the state. And then what does that mean for poverty reduction and for promoting equity? And we see that, again, the state's lowest income earners would actually be harmed the most. And again, we've talked about what groups lie in that category. And then the state's wealthiest will also, or will actually benefit the most. So overall, this tax bill provides a tax cut to the wealthy. It shifts the state's tax burden further to lower middle income earners, because again, it was already inequitable before these proposals were made. And then it would deepen the inequities within the system because incomes are impacted by race and gender as well. And so I like to say tax policies aren't race neutral and they aren't gender neutral. And so those components are important to realize as well. Before we kind of wrap up the discussion about what an equitable tax system looks like and what good tax policy looks like, I want to again open it up for questions just to make sure that everybody has a good understanding of this particular bill and what it means.
Hello, Ms. Roba, I have a question. I enjoyed your presentation. Can you talk a little bit more about what you mean by the sales tax broadening and particularly what categories are being broadened?
There were, I don't have all of them listed in front of me. There were about maybe 15 or so places in which the state lawmakers proposed to increase the sales tax. So for instance, there, like farm equipment, there were some sales tax rates that do not stand at the normal 7% sales tax rate as other items. And so there were some sales tax rates that were like 1%, 1.5%. And so state lawmakers proposed to increase those tax rates to 3.5%. I can provide that list because, like I said, I don't have it right in front of me. So those were some of the sales tax broadenings that we were talking about. It was mostly farm equipment. There were some vehicles and some other things. So sales tax broadening is actually something that's an equitable tax policy. So if you increase the amount of things that you can raise tax revenue on, that's actually good for the state because it increases the amount of revenue that comes into the state, especially when you have items that are taxed at like 1%, whereas food is taxed at 7%, like a necessity. That's something that we would actually like to see. But again, the modeling in terms of trying to understand the impact that would have on the state without a fiscal note was hard to develop or produce.
Okay, thank you.
Did y'all have any other questions about this particular bill and its impact on Mississippians? Okay, I'll talk a little bit. Oh, I'm sorry.
I said, all I can say is that it's a bill that is very scary, and just on surface that I think that our people are going to lose the overall picture, just like Matthew have just said, and we got such a short willing to try to educate. That kind of scares me, but I'm committed to do whatever that we need to do to make sure that our community. Now, let me ask you this. So I guess game plan, and that would be NAACP and all of us. What's going to be our game plan as to say there are so many of us that do not know our senators? Is there a way that for all the branches, that when we send this information out, this Matthew question, I think that we list who your senator are, who you should be calling?
And Mr. Hampton, so when we said advocacy alerts, if we don't list a direct person that people can contact, so like a committee chair, right? So for like this past bill, the voter purge bill that just died last week, we had folks called a committee chairman of the House Apportionment and Elections Committee. So that's the person we directed our energy towards.
Okay.
For a bill like this, where we might have folks say, hey, we need you to call your individual senator, then what we'll do in the advocacy alert, we'll post a link that people can go to and they can put in their address. And once they put in their address, it'll tell them who their state senator or state representative is.
Now, I don't receive those alerts.
So we send them through the Sean can probably tell you a little more about it, how we send them. But I think you're on the list, sir. The list, Mr. Hampton. It comes from Mississippi State Conference, NAACP. I know sometimes mine goes to my junk mail, so sometimes you might have to check your junk mail because sometimes mine comes to my regular inbox. Sometimes it goes to my junk mail. I don't know why it does that, but it does that sometimes. So
Okay.
you might have to check your junk mail because it might go to your junk mail sometimes.
I seen Matthew, I was on the Mississippi State NAACP Facebook, and I was able to do it by sharing that link and responding to that call to action off our Facebook page.
Yeah. And so anytime you get one of those emails where we do those advocacy alerts, feel free to disseminate that information, to your community and urge people to join us and make calls, because that purge bill that just died wouldn't have been possible if people didn't apply pressure to the committee chairman on last week and urge him to oppose that bill, which would have disenfranchised thousands of eligible voters across the state. And we know where that would have had a disproportionate impact in our communities. So we'll be doing the same thing with this bill, making sure that we get that information out there and make sure that folks make calls to their legislators.
And Matthew, I'll add that Corey mentioned in the chat. So we're hoping that it doesn't come up for a vote.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I was just reiterating what you said. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so we're hoping that it doesn't come up for a vote, but the deadline would be March 16th. And in terms of the lieutenant governor, I guess, well, I'll say this again about the vote. The other thing that we've just been concerned about again is that especially that income tax elimination proposal has been something that's been talked about a good deal, and it's kind of a recurring proposal. And so, we want to continue to apply pressure to let state lawmakers know how we feel about it and the concerns that we have about its impact and the tax shift burden. And so we do want to lift it up still as much as we can, because even if it dies this session, it's likely something that we'll see in a future legislative session. There was an article about the lieutenant governor. He's saying that he's not supportive. I know that some people have been saying again that, it's not necessarily dead yet, and there could be amendments to it and things like that. So again, it's something that we're concerned about and looking at, and we want to make sure that we continue to apply pressure on that, because it did have a good bit of Democratic support in the House, which was something else that we were concerned about. And I know that it's 12. If you guys give me about 10 more minutes, we're going to talk about what a good like some good stuff, what a good tax system might look like, and things like that. And so there are other fiscal policy matters that we're tracking. So House Bill 1439, and specifically the income tax elimination, is something that, you know, we've been concerned about, and we've been looking at, and what's been kind of the major tax policies introduced in this legislative session. There are some other things surrounding maybe a possible increase of the gas tax. There was a pink tax proposal in terms of feminine hygiene products. So all of those tax proposals are in the grocery tax reduction are things that we've been tracking. Some other fiscal policy matters that you'll see from us, or information that you'll see from us, will revolve around a possible implementation of the state earned income tax credit. We've done some analysis, or some provided information to lawmakers around COVID-19 relief funding. So again, we're talking about the federal amount of federal money that comes into the state to help fund the government. That COVID relief money is a huge deal. A possible increase in the minimum wage, which is something that we'll continue to promote. And then just looking at the funding of these services and programs that we all care about, such as education and criminal justice, and where that money goes. Spending, how the state spends the money is an important part in equity and strengthening communities as well. And that's something, again, that you guys have a knowledge on. Medicaid expansion is something that we'll push. Creating an equal pay law in Mississippi, because we're the only state that doesn't have one. And then tax reform overall, or some of the other fiscal policy matters that you'll see from us. Out of these, I want to talk about the earned income tax credit just quickly, because this is something that you'll hear from us in the future about. So you all might be familiar with the federal earned income tax credit. And we want people to be, our communities to be aware that some states also have a state earned income tax credit that help provide benefit to the state's working families. So an earned income tax credit is basically a credit that benefits low to moderate income working families by reducing personal income tax liability. So when we talked about income taxes, this particular tax credit helps provide money or give money back to these lower and middle income household families, and it helps offset that inequitable tax system because these families pay, again, more in sales taxes and other taxes than they do in this particular tax. But depending on the family's income, including salaries and wages, whether they're married or single, and the number of qualifying children, the earned income tax credit will allow for a tax credit equal to a certain percentage of the family's earnings. So for example, for tax year 2021, a married couple with 2 children with an adjusted gross income of $53,865 or less could have claimed up to $5,980 in federal credit. So that's money that will come back into their pockets. Again, we would like for Mississippi to create our state earned income tax credit to kind of complement what's going on the federal level. Currently, 29 states, including Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico, have a state earned income tax credit. Just to give you an idea about how the federal credit is used in Mississippi, for the previous tax year, 359,000 families received approximately $1 billion in this credit from the federal government. And on average, a family received $2,903. And so there have been calls to expand the federal income tax credit, earned income tax credit, to help working families. Again, this is something that we would like to see in Mississippi. We did receive modeling again from the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy. And the graph basically shows you that this is a policy that will actually reduce the amount of taxes paid for people who are actually paying taxes, or for families who are actually paying taxes. You can see how it helps the lower and middle income families by providing savings of around $300 per income group. And you'll see that this is a proposal that will actually benefit lower and middle income families. So you see the lowest income earners will actually receive the most benefit from this particular proposal. This is in contrast to something, a call such as the proposal to eliminate the individual income tax. So this is something that you'll receive more information about. This is an example of a good tax policy that will help working families. And so we wanted to talk about what an equitable tax system is and just end on that. And so basically what we can see is something to help make the state's tax system more fair. These are some progressive policies or policies that will kind of support working families. So just to highlight some of them, we would ask or call for the state to enact progressive tax systems that support requiring wealthier individuals to pay their fair share. So Mississippi today produced a report in 2017 that said that Mississippi has experienced over $577 million in tax cuts and over 51 tax cuts since 2012. And so most of these tax cuts have been geared towards wealthier individuals and corporations. And again, a more equitable tax system will require wealthier individuals to pay their fair share of the state's tax burden. And that's something that will actually help increase revenue to help support these programs and services that we all care about, and that will help promote equity. Introducing or expanding low-income tax credits, which would benefit, again, lower income families the most, such as the earned income tax credit. That's a way to stabilize or equalize the state's tax system. Criminal justice reform, to invest in services and programs that raise revenue. And so again, where the state spends its money is just as important as how much money comes in, because if it's being spent in a way that again increases inequities or income inequality, then that doesn't help us at all. So seeing or tracking how the state spends its money is also important. Modernizing the sales tax, again, that's where that sales tax base broadening to come in, increasing the number of things to where the state could require the sales tax, and increasing the sales tax on some items will help raise revenue. So for instance, states have weak laws or sometimes no laws regarding internet sales and things like that. So there are some things within the state sales tax system that can be reformed. And then what's not on this list is actually strengthening the state sales tax base. So excuse me, not sales tax, the state's income tax base. So making that top bracket of income earners pay a little bit more of their income in the income tax is something that will help raise revenue and help support the services and programs that we all care about. And lastly, I'm going to end it with kind of looping back around to how do we advance racial equity within tax policy, and to see some of the things that we're concerned about and some of the challenges. And so that report that I mentioned, it talked about law versus bias. So we know that some laws help protect kind of racial disparities, but there might be some biases related in there that the law doesn't account for. So just making sure that we're aware of that, and we're promoting policies that help take that away. So for instance, an example would be housing. So there are some laws about discrimination in housing and affordable housing and things like that. But then what do you do when you have a property owner that may have prejudices and racism that the law doesn't necessarily account for? Or what do you see in terms of policies or where housing places are and things like that, redlining, all that kind of stuff. So those are some things that we have to consider when we're promoting tax policy and making sure that we think of policies that help advance racial equity within tax policy. Political power is something that I know the NAACP and One Voice always talks about, and so we have to be careful about disenfranchisement, redistricting, and gerrymandering. And then in terms of policy, again, Mississippi isn't alone in this, but in 45 of the 50 states, state and local tax systems actually worsen racial and ethnic inequalities. And so we have to make sure that we promote policies that reverse that. Again, we're thinking about progressive versus regressive tax policies. So progressive tax policies such as rolling back corporate taxes, or increasing taxes on the 1%, making corporations pay their fair share. Those are examples of progressive policies. Increasing the sales tax rate, on the other hand, is an example of a regressive policy that will hurt lower and middle income individuals. And then of course, state spending. How does the state spend its money? So this is my contact information. I know that was a lot of information, and I hope you guys learned some things to see kind of what an equitable tax system looks like, and what it could mean for Mississippi, and just to see the impact of current policies on the state. So we hope that we are able to keep in touch with you all. And Yeah, and Corey mentioned it. Let us know if there are other topics that you like more information on. So we're hoping to do more of these on other topics. And we're hoping just to be a resource for the community, including the lawmakers, community members, and even the media. And that's my presentation. So thank you again for having me here today. I greatly appreciate it, and I enjoyed talking to you all and being able to discuss House Bill 1439 and all these other issues in terms of fiscal policy with you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you a lot, Kyra. You really gave us some great information about fiscal policy and about that bill. We really appreciate you. I hope everybody enjoyed Kyra's presentation. Thank you so much for that information. Next week at the same time, next Saturday, everybody will be having another webinar. This one will be about the Paycheck Protection Program, which is a program aimed at small business relief. And so we'll be talking about minority small business relief, making sure that minority small businesses, which support communities all across the state, understand the application process, understand how they can access those funds. So we'll be talking about that same time next week, and we'll be sending out the information, the registration link about that. So please share with your communities, and we're hoping to make sure that we can share some great information next week as well. But we want to thank you, Kyra. Thank you, everybody, for being on. We really appreciate it. And I hope everybody has a great remainder of their day. Bye, everybody.
Thank y'all. Thank you, Matthew and Karen. Thank y'all for all y'all done.
All right, thank y'all.
Thank you.